Death, an Oral History Part 2. Steve DiGiorgio. He had just recorded the Mutilation demo. They didn't really have a bass player. Once we, the Sadist guys, started hanging out, we'd look for some out-of-the-way places to drink beer. It was a big gang. When it came to band practice, they played in Chris's bedroom at Chris's mom and dad's house. Sadist also practiced in a bedroom, but it was Darren, Travis's house. He lived with his dad. He was cool with us hanging there and making noise. Chris had a really nice white Neil Peart Tama drum set. John Allen was really envious of it, so he said, "Set it up in our practice room and I'll let you use our room for your band rehearsal." Sadist would have a rehearsal using Chris's Tama set for 45 minutes, and then Chuck and Chris would rehearse for 45 minutes. Since my bass rig was in the same room, I down-tuned my bass and jammed with Death. I was part of the setup. It didn't feel like I was in the band. Malcolm Schuldiner. Chuck was very excited to actually see the fruits of his labour. He was so passionate about his music. He was thrilled to actually be able to hold a professionally produced CD in his hands. Kursion. I thought Scream Bloody Gore was a great first album, and it was the perfect representation of Death at that stage of the band's career. It was brutally heavy and raw, but it had a certain musicality to it as well, which was missing from bands like, say, Venom and Bathory and Hellhammer. Royfurt. John Hand, Scream Bloody Gore's credited rhythm guitarist, was a friend of ours. Basically, what happened was the album was recorded and Chuck had gone back to Florida again, and we were talking about having John play guitar in the band. We decided to just assume it would work out to the point of having his photo put on the back of the album cover. We did specifically tell Combat to state that Chuck played all the guitars and bass, but they ignored the instructions and it ended up looking like John actually played on the album. Unfortunately, he didn't work out in the band, and by the time we figured that out, it was too late. DiGiorgio. They thought about asking me to play bass on Scream Bloody Gore. I remember hearing it. I asked Kate who played bass. Chuck was like, "I had to do it, it sucked." I said to Chuck, "Dude, I would have done it. I've been practicing your songs for weeks." Chuck backhanded Chris and said, "I told you we should have asked him." I was that close to being on the first album. Royfurt. One day we were talking on the phone and he told me he wanted to stay in Florida. I was really disappointed to hear that, of course. He said that I could come back to Florida and remain in the band, but I wasn't too keen on the thought of moving. Between the humid, hot Florida weather and the fact that my friends and family are all over here, I decided to stay and we officially parted ways. Delilo. This is around Christmas '87. I was done with Massacre. It was like beating a dead horse. I mean, Chris wasn't coming to Florida. He was 16 or 17. I remember I told Chuck, "Hey, I've got a bass player and a drummer. If you want to get together and jam." Terry Butler, Bill Andrews and myself had learnt a few of the Scream songs. We ended up rehearsing at Padlock Mini Storage in Tampa. Butler. When we first practiced, it was amazing. That was my inauguration into the Death lineup. Our first show was 3 weeks later at Milwaukee Metal Fest. We did a tour right after for Scream Bloody Gore. Eric Greif. I first met Charles Schuldiner at Milwaukee Metal Fest in the summer of 1987. I was a jack of all trades producer, manager and concert promoter, and he was playing his first Scream Bloody Gore dates with the Leprosy lineup. We had a cool talk, but I didn't get to know him properly for another half year when I promoted Death's Milwaukee date when they were playing some Midwestern shows with Chicago demo band Syndrome. Leprosy and Spiritual Healing, 1988 to 90. Butler. Shortly after the Scream Bloody Gore tour, we started writing Leprosy. Everyone was contributing. Rick, Bill and Chuck hammered out Leprosy. I was at the beginning stages of my confidence as a writer. We were a total band. It was cool to be part of the scene. There weren't many death metal bands touring. Maybe Possessed and Dark Angel. You could feel something was happening at the time. Greif. I thought Chuck was friendly and a bit charismatic, but he was also 20 years old and had that I can do anything forward-looking invincibility about him that I thought I had myself. We took one long ride in my Dodge Daytona, and the next thing I knew, I was his manager. Scott Burns. I first met Chuck while working with Dan Johnson on Leprosy. I was the engineer. He was a cool guy. You could definitely tell he wanted to be taken seriously as a musician while still being brutal. But that's true of the American scene. The musicians wanted to be known as competent. That's what separated death metal from punk rock. Butler. We had already done some shows, but when we went to record, I was the last one. I had 4 hours to record the bass. Here I am, I had been playing bass for about a year at that point, and everyone is looking at me. Chuck, Bill, Rick, producer Dan Johnson, and engineer Scott Burns. I had an anxiety attack. I froze up. I had already laid the bass down for 4 songs. They only used one of my bass tracks, so I asked Chuck, I need you to finish the bass. I don't know what's going on with me. I feel like I'm going to die. But remember, I was a finger player. Dan wanted me to play with a pick, so using a pick and having people stare at me while I tracked contributed to my anxiety. Delilah. We co-wrote pretty much everything. There were a lot of songs that he wrote by himself, but I had a lot of riffs on Scream Bloody Gore and even on Spiritual Healing. I wasn't even credited for those riffs. No disrespect, I signed all that stuff away. A riff's a riff. What am I going to do, cry about it? Nah. Butler. When we got the first copies of Leprosy, it was like, wow, my picture was on the back, I couldn't believe it, I felt like I'd made it. But it was really cool seeing my name in the songwriting credits for Spiritual Healing. Delilah. I never had a beef with Chuck. We had one little skirmish on stage at a small club called the Electric Banana. The stage was about a foot tall, people were less than a foot from you. He said, "Did you give me a dirty look?" "I don't have any room over here," I replied. "Why would I give you a dirty look? I don't have any room over here." Jane Shaldina. Like the other parents, I was very concerned about Chuck's going to Europe. Before he left for touring, I investigated the places he was going, and there was unrest in some of them. Though it made no difference to his enthusiasm to go, knowing that his band were aware of all that meant they could be prepared. Chuck loved Europe and his fans there. Delilah. We wrote Leprosy and recorded it with Dan Johnson, who had worked with the first Sabotage and Dungeons Are Calling. We toured that and did the Ultimate Revenge 2 tour. That was with Dark Angel. We did the Ultimate Revenge 2 video. That was when musical differences came to light. Chuck was into the tech stuff. I remember he started asking me if I practiced. I didn't. It didn't make sense to me. Tech stuff in death metal? So we parted ways, we remained friends. Butler. The incident that pushed Chuck over the edge was when Death was supposed to play 3 or 4 shows up the East Coast. Rick didn't want to do it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Grife. Chuck asked me to terminate Rick after a few missed rehearsals, and I think I did so immediately on the phone. But that was merely a convenient excuse. The real reasons, Chuck said, quite a few times had to do with the whammy bars, moustaches and hairbrush use, and I don't really need to elaborate on that. What I will say is that Rick took it like a gentleman and did not create any problems as a result of the sacking, and Chuck was relieved that there was no conflict. Cursion. As far as Chuck's songwriting and vocal performance were concerned, Leprosy was absolutely the logical successor to Scream Bloody Gore. The only issue I had with it was the fact that I found Bill Andrews' drumming too boring, lifeless and completely devoid of any imagination. He was basically nothing more than a timekeeper. I made my opinion very clear to Chuck, but he strongly disagreed and defended Bill, which I found baffling at the time. At one point he even said to me that Bill's performance on Leprosy was on par with Dave Lombardo's playing on Slayer's Rain in Blood, a comment that I found to be laughable. Butler. I had known James Murphy when he was in Agent Steel. I remember telling Chuck when we needed a guitar player, "I know a dude who shreds, but he's in Atlanta now. He's with Hallows Eve." Chuck called him up from his bedroom and asked James to join. James was like, "Sure, let me pack my bags and I'll be out of here." James slid right into the band. I don't even think we had him learn the old songs, we just started writing Spiritual Healing. Grife. We had actually contracted with another guitar player, but that fell through. The other name that kept surfacing was James. It was entirely up to Chuck whom he would feel comfortable playing with, and he made the call to go with James. James Murphy. In 1987 I signed on with a band, Agent Steel, who needed a fill-in guitar player. I went over to Europe and the UK as a teenager. Once I got back I started teaching guitar, but I'd go out to shows with my Agent Steel tour shirt. Remember, I was a fan of Death, I had Scream Bloody Gore, and I had just bought Leprosy. So Death were playing at the Sunset Club in Tampa. I went to the show. Chuck and the guys were walking about. I walked past Chuck and he said, "Hey man, cool shirt." I told him I had done the tour. He was interested and started asking me a lot of questions. He eventually introduced me to Bill and Terry. After that I headed up to Atlanta on my own. I roomed with this guitar player, Dave Stewart, from Hallows Eve. I got a landscaping job and then proceeded to check out the Atlanta Institute of Music. Death, an oral history, end of the first half. I'm afraid that's where I'm going to have to leave it, people. I've read all that I'm allowed to. I would like to reiterate that I've only read half of the story. If you want to know more, pick up the magazine from Decibel. All the links to buy the magazine are in the description. I would just like to add thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to share the rest of the story with you. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Albert and Decibel Magazine for letting me share part of the death story online. And you know, people, if you want to get the rest of it, just go buy it. There's no excuses. If you're even mildly a death fan, it's extremely cheap. They ship worldwide, and hopefully down the line in the future I can team up with Decibel again to finish the story.